Bookaholics is a safe place for reading junkies who obsess over books, authors, bookstores, book news, and book trivia. We'll nerd out with book reviews, author interviews, our habit, and other bookish things. Here is your host, Deirdre Pippins.
Hi, Mindy. Welcome to the Bookaholic podcast.
Hi, Deidre. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm so glad you're here because all year long I've been doing a series called the Mental Health Series. Ever since May, because that was Mental Health Awareness Month. And I've talked to all types of authors who've written books or shared their story of different mental health and traumatic issues. However, we have not had anybody talk about grief. And so I am so glad to have you here. Death is a part of life. And a lot of people are not told that phrase and so death is very scary. Grief is very traumatic. And so let's just delve into your book, which is titled Restorative Grief, and just talk about that whole process and the restorative grief model. I can't wait to see what that is. So,
Yeah.
what would make you write a book about grief?
That is a great question because it is definitely not the book I ever set out to write when I first started deciding I want to be a writer someday. But in 2016, I lost my mom. She was one of many losses over the course of my life, to the point where I've pretty much lost track of how many loved ones we've had that have died, moved, divorced, or any other impactful grief event that may not be connected to a death. And so my own work trying to find healing from losing my mom carried into 2020 when I experienced a miscarriage, had a job loss, was dealing with COVID on top of everything else, and then had another job loss. And I decided in that moment of recognizing the shutdown in the US for about 2 weeks that it was not going to be 2 weeks. It was going to be generational, that we were about to experience generations of untended grief. And I didn't want to live in a world that had that baggage attached to it. And so in my own small corner of the world, I decided I could write a book about my experience of faith and loss and where the intersection of the two really were beneficial and where there were a lot of issues. And so the book is really a 31-day guidebook and memoir of my own experience through grief and in the framework of the church, but also in finding practices that are meaningful and align myself or can align my values with what I'm experiencing in life and how I move through the grief process. So the restorative grief model itself looks at the whole person, heart, mind, body, and spirit, and invites us to have curiosity about what values we are living into that help bring alignment to those areas, and which values we are putting on a pedestal or maybe holding on to that do not serve us anymore in this new season of loss in life that we're in.
Right. Exactly. And there's so much to unpack from what you just stated. And I hope I can keep track of the different things. I might jot myself some notes. But you speak of this period of loss. And truly, once we got through the actual pandemic of COVID-19, it was a worldwide loss. All of us experienced that. Knew someone. One of my cousins died during the COVID area from COVID, and so I think pretty much everybody knows of someone. I won't say necessarily close, but knows of someone who died due to COVID or during that period of time. Now, with that said, I'm going to go all the way back for me. So my parents were always older. So say when I was in the third grade, all of my classmates' parents were maybe in their 30s or late 20s. My parents were already in their 50s. And so once they struck 50 years old, I was like, I began to think, my parents are old. I'm in the third grade. My parents are old. I might lose them I mean, I was a kid who was always praying, please God, let my mom
Mm.
see me graduate from high school, me get married, etc., etc. So death anxiety. And it's
Mhm.
something that I still have, that both of my parents are deceased now. But it is still something that I deal with. It's not as maybe in an uncontrolled state as it was when I was a child, because I, of course, grown in my faith since the third grade. But it still can be there. When you're now approach certain ages, hey, you're not 24 anymore, but inevitably everybody is going to die. So what do you speak on death anxiety?
Yeah, so we call that anticipatory grief, where we're experiencing parts of the grief story and grief experience before the loss even occurs. And anticipatory grief can be very confusing because, and I like the phrase death anxiety too, because it really speaks to that lack of control that we experience when we're anxious about the future. And so when
Mhm,
we realize we can't stop death, we can't stop, our lives from spiraling in different directions based on loss of any
mhm.
kind, we get really trapped in that thought process that tries to solve what we can't,
Yes,
what we see coming and as inevitable. And I think
right.
that recognizing the ability to become present is a really difficult, it's an easy thing to say, it's a really difficult thing to do. We all
Yeah.
contain the ability to become present and really cultivate a sense of groundedness and mindfulness in the moment that says, yes, this will come, but today I'm okay. Right now,
Right.
these are the things that keep me connected and that I'm grounded with. But I think anticipatory grief really gives us an opportunity to decide, well, what is it that we value in this season? A lot of
Mhm,
times people will say, oh, if they're going to die, if when my mom was sick, she was
mhm,
died of cancer, and
mhm,
she was diagnosed, between diagnosis and death was 4 months. And I had a handful of people tell me, make sure you say everything that's important to you, make sure you close all the gaps, make sure you express blah blah blah, all this advice about things I should be doing. Well, the truth is, I don't think that that's meaningful for everyone. For some people, that might be what they need. In a lot more cases, I find that what people need in that season is to really become curious about themselves and their person and what they're anticipating the loss of, and
mhm, mhm,
decide, well, if this is what I value about this relationship and this is what I'm afraid of losing, am I living into that value right now? Am I
mhm,
cultivating connectedness if that's what I value? Am I cultivating honesty if I've been
mhm,
feeling like
mhm,
there are secrets? It
mhm,
really
mhm.
goes back to, for me, knowing I can't control the present, but I can respond accordingly to what I want and who I want to be in the present.
Well, I remember my mother also died of cancer, lung cancer. This was back in
Mm,
1996. And as she lay basically dying, I didn't have any advice from anyone, but something that had been plaguing me all my life, all my life. And I said, you know what? I've got to ask her because I don't want her to die and then I never have the answer. And I asked her. Now, this is a person that was born in the 1920s, so it's
mm,
1996. And so I asked her, I said, Mama, why didn't you hug me and tell me that you loved me and all of these things? Why didn't you tell me these things? Because I was a great kid, but I didn't give my parents any trouble or any problems. I was a straight A student. I was a teenager leader, so it wasn't like I was a quote unquote bad teenager or a bad
mm,
kid. So,
mm.
what would you say to all of that I just unfolded?
Well, I think we all gain a sense of finality and expression through our grief process in different ways. To your point,
Mhm,
we're all very different people. And I think our
mhm,
grief stories are as unique as we are as humans.
yeah,
And so when you have an opportunity to express your experience of grief outside
mhm,
of the like traditional expected way of pursuing
mhm,
closure or
Mhm.
healing or anything like that. I think that that's a beautiful and meaningful way to connect with your memories. And it shows that you've integrated your grief story into your daily experience of life as well, which I think is the goal. I don't actually really believe in closure. I think there are things we can do that bring maybe a sense of finality, but the idea of closure also leads us to believe that our grief experience is finished, and that's just
Right,
not true.
right,
Anybody, as you know, like in your experience, grief is ongoing and it may become subtle and
mhm,
be the undercurrent of a life season of life, but it
mhm.
really is something that we carry with us because it shifts who we are. And so the more
Right.
that we work towards integrating that new understanding of who we are, I think the more that those actions on our behalf, like decorating for fall and taking a
Mhm,
moment to acknowledge our mom's connection to that, I think it's quite
mhm.
meaningful.
Yes, 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 and to go back to something you said earlier in our conversation is to be intentional in the in the moment. And one of the things I realize about time, and again to state, fall is my favorite time of year. And I even wrote in my planner, be intentional each and every day and recognize that this is the beautiful fall, the fall that you love. So I've been doing
Mm,
steps like getting out in my yard so that I can see the leaves, the
mm, mhm.
decorating part, the whole thing, absorbing fall. And then now that we're talking about my mother love the fall and decorating for fall, that whole thing is coming into it. And that's all very intentional that I'm embracing. So I
Mhm.
agree with that. I think that is definitely something that people could do to really help them through the grieving process.
Yeah. Yeah, those little actions seem insignificant, but they are genuinely some of the most meaningful things because they're accessible. They're
Mhm.
not prohibited by cost. They're not
Right.
really like not labor intensive, but like mentally involved. You don't have to do a ton of really hard thinking or studying to really engage with those little things that mean so much that are just part of the flow of our lives.
Yes, most definitely. Now, we're talking now about faith, and this is just my opinion only. When I look at society, I'll say American society, I see faith. I won't say faith. I see religion is going down, as in
Mm,
not as many people go to church. Even for me right now, and I've still got to kind of get back into the groove. I live like 30 minutes from my church. It is very
mm,
difficult for me to get up on Sunday mornings and go to church anymore because they changed the time to a lot earlier and it's only one service. My point is, I want to go. I'm trying to go. I haven't lost my faith or anything like that. But I'm just saying that being, say, going to church being not necessarily faith, but all of that once you get going and you get in the mode of listening and then more absorbing and have a more personal relationship, I just think a lot of people don't even consider faith or anything when it comes to grief. I know a lot of people who do not practice a faith. Unfortunately, I know a lot of people who do not practice faith in any type of way. They're either agnostic or atheist people. What would you say to those people? And when you're talking also about faith in your guide?
mm. It's a good question. Actually, a large portion of clients that I have grown to know and love are not practicers of faith. And so, the first thing I tell people about my book is, hey, this is my memoir. This is my experience of grief and processing through faith. If
Mhm.
you have a baggage or a wound or hurt that comes from an experience of faith or spirituality, don't buy my book because it's going
Right,
to trigger you and cause further harm. And that's not the
right,
goal.
right,
But
right.
the restorative grief model, the reason I love using it so much with people is it's accessible wholly within or without specific faith practice. And so when you look at the whole person, who in our thoughts and our mind, our emotions in our heart, our feelings in our body, our somatic feelings, and our spirit, I look at the spirit as our ability to connect with ourselves,
Mhm.
one another, the world at large, and with our experience of God. And so
Mhm.
a lot of times, and this is certainly true for me, when grief enters the chat, faith takes not a back seat, but a very complicated, like, passenger seat
Yeah.
conversation and
Yeah.
role. Because in my experience, so many of the things I was taught about spirituality, and I have a background in Pentecostal church, so there was a lot
Mhm.
of faith healing and speaking in tongues, and
Mhm.
a lot of completely unmoving, not practical exercises and things that resulted, we'd pray for people and they would die anyway, or we'd pray for healing
Yeah.
and they would die anyway. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I have capacity to say, well, that's okay. I did not have capacity to continue listening to people who said, well, if you had XYZ, did you fast and pray before your mom died? Did you lay hands on her before she died? And these were questions I was asking myself too, because my experience of faith said that those things should work. It was devastating and horrible and wrong and untrue. And yet I was immersed in a culture that believed in those
Right.
cognitive dissonances. And so
Right. Right.
I think that that becomes the most convoluted thing when you are within a faith practice. You are also experiencing the secondary loss after a grief event of your sense of self, of your sense of connectedness to your faith, of your sound mind that you
Mhm.
felt very safe within. You have
Mhm.
suddenly invasive thoughts and intrusive thoughts and emotions that come out of nowhere and feel very foreign. And faith doesn't necessarily hold a lot of space for that part of our life experience. It's very
Mhm.
focused on eternal life and focus on
Right.
tomorrow and let go and
Right.
let God, which was a
Mhm.
phrase that my mom used to use. And every time
Mhm.
she said it, I wanted to scream. And sometimes I did, because in my
Yes.
opinion, I'm like, it's not about letting go. It's about partnership and integration. And every time you tell me to let go, you're minimizing my experience by telling me God is
Yeah.
greater. And that
Yeah.
spiritual
Yeah.
bypassing is so harmful. It's not loving the way we think it is.
Right. Well, these phrases say like let go and let God. I understand where that comes from because a
Sure.
lot of people are just wrapped up in trying to fix something themselves when inevitably things do happen. Good things happen to bad
Right.
people. I mean, bad things happen to good people, switch it around, but things happen. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes in our religion or spirituality, we don't make it realistic, and the
Yeah.
Bible can be realistic. It's like really man who turns it into unrealistic practices.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you were speaking of people who, did you lay hands on your mother before she died? Well, the thing about it is we can do all the practices that we think God wants us to do, but
Yeah.
inevitably we belong to God, and we all have, when he calls us home, we have to go. That's
Yeah.
what I was always taught.
Sure.
And I remember being a little kid, this is scary, totally scary. My mother telling me we're born to die. And
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, well, I'm just 6. Why are you telling me we are born to die? But she was right. She never did put any rose colored glasses on my eyes, but
Sure.
it's still the fact that you have to really take in and absorb when someone passes away, so it's a lot. There's a lot that can be
Yeah.
there. you know um my sister is a widow, and
Mm.
her husband died in 1997. And one day they don't have any children. One day he just simply walks outside to rake some leaves or do some things in the yard, and he never came back inside. He had a
Mm.
massive heart attack, and he was just gone. He left out of the house, didn't get in a car accident, just went out the door, and then he was just gone. So what do you say? A lot of people, I
Mm.
remember my sister doing this. She was just in the initial hours just kept looking at that door and wanting him to come back in that door. So
Yeah.
in your practice, if I came to you and said that, he just simply went outside. I don't understand why he didn't come back in that door. How would you handle that kind of phrase in your practice?
Mm. Well, I think you have to acknowledge that that's a traumatic experience. And a lot
Mhm.
of grief work in the world right now does not have trauma informed education behind it. There's a
Mhm.
lot of um, quick fixes we want to say of, well, let's do some activities and walk
Mhm.
ourselves through the door and acknowledge the setting in the backyard.
Mhm.
A lot of things that just dismiss the fact that no, actually the door itself is triggering a deep trauma that occurred,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
giving ourselves permission to recognize that.
Mhm.
um, Even, we can call them little t traumas or big T traumas when,
Mhm.
if we want to put a hierarchy to it. But I'm really not a fan of the hierarchies, just because they encourage us to minimize our own pain and our own experience.
Yeah. Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think that in that setting, in my experience, a lot of platitudes come into the conversation where we
Mhm.
start trying to make it better for someone, when the
Mhm.
truth is they just need someone else to acknowledge, yeah, that door became a very unsafe place. That literal
Yeah,
threshold
yeah.
is no longer something you can trust right now. And that makes a lot of sense because your person walked through it and then didn't return. No
Yeah.
wonder you don't trust that door. No wonder looking at that door is horrifying and
Mm.
debilitating and makes you feel like you need to freeze.
Right, right, right. Well, she did at that time, within that year, she moved from that house. She just left
Mm,
that house, and of course,
yeah,
there were other logical things, like too big for her to take care of by herself,
sure.
certain things. She moved to a townhouse, but, that's always interesting. It just, and sometimes it depends on how a person passes away that affects grief. Have
Mhm.
you found that, whether it's through, a car accident versus a long battle with a condition or disease? Have you seen any differences in that?
I think yes, in that there's a degree of loss that we experience regardless of how the person died or how we experienced the loss, whether it wasn't even a death.
Mhm,
But I think that it really depends on that person. So I can say yes, I've experienced differences in how people start the healing process, but I think it's more reflected in the people supporting the griever.
mhm,
So you'll have COVID's a great example. A very beautiful friend of ours in this valley died of COVID, and
mhm.
the first question, and I'm sure you heard it with many
Mhm.
people too, well, were they vaccinated?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and I wanna grab those people lovingly around the shoulders and say, "That does not matter, and it's not your question to ask."
right,
And does
right.
that change anything other than your decision to be bitter? Or maybe that's a self-protective question to say, "Well, maybe I don't need to grieve this person because maybe they weren't vaccinated, so I can justify saying like, 'Oh,
Yeah,
well, they had it coming.'" I think that's a
yeah,
very, very harmful response. And I'm
yeah, that is. That is.
so
That
I
really
think that,
is.
same thing is true with elderly people versus children dying, right? They'll say,
Mhm,
"Well, they had a
mhm.
nice life. They were old. They lived a long life."
Right.
Or they'll say, uh, what's another one I hear often? Oh, people who are grieving someone who died of a drug overdose. Well, maybe if they hadn't had an addiction or used drugs. And again, failing to recognize the trauma that goes
Mm,
into the decision or the addictive behavior to
mhm.
self-protect with drug use. There's a
Right.
complete lack of trauma awareness, and so that alone affects
Mhm.
our individual responses. That's the grief literacy I wanted to see come to pass in the world so that we could
Yeah.
stop causing additional harm, because statements like that only serve to further distance us from one another. And
Most definitely. I can
yeah.
only imagine what people say about those who take their own lives, suicide.
Oh, right. So I actually work with a couple of people who have personally experienced death by suicide, but I also work with an organization in my state that
Mhm,
has educators that go into cities that they're postvention specialists. So after a youth has died by suicide, they are organizing responses to support the community in the aftermath. And the
Mhm.
misunderstandings and misconceptions about people who die by suicide are very evident in the language we use. So if we say committed suicide, well, that's the same language we use to vilify and call things crimes. And when the
Yes.
truth is they died by suicide, they did
Yeah.
not commit a crime. They perceived that they were going to create less pressure, less burden, any number of things. But death by
Mhm.
suicide is not a crime, it's death. And I think that alone changes the conversation. But yeah, you're not wrong. That's if there was one type of
Yeah.
loss that we really are afraid to talk about, it's definitely death by suicide.
Yeah, yeah, that was so, weaponized
Mhm.
biblically, by people that may not know what they're talking about
Right.
anyway, because the Bible is very, convoluted, and it's not, everybody can't not interpret it correctly, and
Right.
so, I understand where it comes from, don't get me wrong,
Sure.
but people, my mother always said, and here I go, she always said, that if someone has a mental health issue, and which anybody who dies by suicide has a mental health issue in some way or some fashion, and so then that always reconciled me to say or think that, they we all still have a chance to go live with your higher power if that's,
Mm.
if that's your belief. But I mean, people were really excruciatingly hard on people who died by suicide, and you're right, it was a
Yeah.
lot of traumatic talk and horrible talk, and really that divided people what would be death by suicide and that aftermath.
Yeah, there's a lot of othering that has to happen in order for us to, as a society or even as individuals, to believe that that would never be something that would happen in our lives or that could happen to us. I
Mhm.
actually think we all have mental health issues because
Yeah,
we are
yeah,
all dealing with emotional
sure,
trauma or suppressed grief
sure.
or 100 different things at any given point. And it's pride that really slows us down from being able to engage that truth of needing therapy and needing community and needing to be vulnerable. And in my experience, faith has been a very easy way to bypass that need or that
Yeah,
pain.
depending
And
on, yeah,
we just control the
yeah,
behaviors by vilifying suicide
yes.
instead of recognizing, well, what's at the root of all these big things they're feeling and thinking and experiencing, and how do we serve that human as valuable as an individual? And so I just
Mhm. You
that
are
yeah,
100%
that's a
right.
whole nother conversation.
It is, I'm sure it is, and so, I've, there's, when all of these different things, mass murders of our children in schools and all of these things, um, that happen, and I think about, okay, there is mental illness in this world, but, I've always said since hearing all these different stories, everybody in the United States needs a mental health evaluation, just like you get a physical. Just like they
Totally.
encourage us to get physicals every year, especially after certain ages. We all need at least, I say at least a mental health exam every 2 to 3 years, just checking in.
Yeah.
How are you doing? Because in 2 to 3 year cycles, something is bound to happen. You
Yeah.
know, nobody has it a smooth road. So yeah, and
Mm.
and different people take different things very deeply and seriously.
Yeah.
Sometimes loss of jobs really take people out. People have committed. I think some guy of maybe of Bed Bath and Beyond. He was a top executive, jumped off of a building because of
Mhm.
the loss of a job or loss of the stock or whatever with Bed Bath and Beyond in the recent months. So sometimes loss of jobs takes people, you know, beyond, healing. So, yeah, definitely,
Yeah.
all of that, it's just, you just don't even know what to say.
Mhm. Yeah.
So,
And I think that that's a big part of the work I've been doing too is helping grievers articulate and figure out what they need, like
Mhm.
genuinely what they need,
Mhm.
not what they would appreciate for an afternoon, but like, what do you need
Mhm.
really?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
also helping grief supporters understand how to be meaningful supporters without minimizing or centering themselves or distancing themselves or causing additional harm by bypassing. And it's been a very, very effective and meaningful way for people to connect with recognizing unintentional harm caused and reckoning with that in a way that is not judgmental of the self. We did what we could, we did what was best and to our knowledge at the time. And now we know that we can do better. And it's created a lot of compassion in this little restorative grief project community, just
Mhm.
because now there are people willing to say, I have no idea what to say. Perfect. Don't
Right.
say anything.
Right.
Perfect. And,
Right.
I'm seeing a lot of increased compassion through silence, through people just listening and saying, like, if you just need to vent, not in a
Mhm.
complainer way, complain, like go and complain and yell and whatever kind of a way, but in a genuinely, I will listen and offer no fixes,
Right.
no corrections, no like
Right.
spiritual arguments. There's a lot of that happens in
Right.
grief. It blows my
Yes.
mind.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really beautiful to see the shift that can happen.
Yes. Now, that's one of the things I was going to ask you. Now, what about even say with the Queen's passing a few
Mhm.
weeks ago? And so, some people think the royal family are impenetrable people, but they're folks, they are people too.
Yeah.
So now that all of the official mourning has passed on the technicality basis
Mhm.
on the calendar. We saw the whole funeral, as it were, that Monday. But now, and they seem to be a big family, but now they're all alone. And that person who was a leader in their family, in their country for 70 years as holding the title of queen is now gone. So what would you say, and this applies to everyone as well, what would you say about after all the pomp and circumstance of funerals and wakes and the repast and people coming to you initially? It's 2 to 3 months down the road. What then?
I think as a griever, 2 to 3 months down the road, you start to recognize who you can trust and who you can't, who
Mm,
can show up for you and who just can't do it.
mm,
Um,
mhm, mhm,
the discomfort of still grieving, quote unquote, is where you really see who has the emotional fortitude to hang on and to recognize that you are going to be grieving for your lifetime. It's just going to
mhm,
look differently over
mhm.
time. As a
Yeah.
grief supporter, 2 to 3 months in is usually when I check back in and be like and offer myself not as a resource necessarily, but just as a reminder, like, "Hey, I see you. I know you're
Mhm,
going through a lot of
mhm,
heavy stuff, and I'm really sorry that I can't fix any of it for you, because if I
mhm.
had the magic wand, da, da, da,"
Right,
a lot of
right.
times with my work too, people will say, "Do you have a quick fix?" And I'm like, "Sure don't. My only
Right.
quick fix is there are no quick fixes." And the sooner you can stop focusing on the idea of a quick fix, the sooner you'll find an authentic fix, an authentic, meaningful experience or practice or technique or tool that can actually support you through your loss.
Yes.
And I think the devastation of being a griever, just a normal human grieving on a national, international platform like the royal family is and was, it's really unfair. There were so many
Mhm.
critics, and I, personally got involved because I was so angry at how Meghan Markle was treated, just the unbelievable assault on her character. I'm like, "Every one of you has no idea. We should all probably
Right.
shut up if we're not, like, married to her or,
No,
no,
exactly.
I think that might be it. I think if we're
Yeah.
married to her, we can speak up and say, "We're worried about you." Otherwise, we
Right,
need to stop,
right, right.
because it's the same
Well,
thing. We get very accusatory in grief because it's easy and it's
yeah.
self-protecting.
Yeah. Well, it's this is a whole nother conversation
Yeah,
also. It's always the woman's fault. It's
right.
always the woman's
Sure.
fault. And then too, if you're a woman of color in that situation, it's definitely going to be your fault.
There's nothing she
So
could
whatever
do.
goes
Yeah.
down, it's all the woman's fault. But again, another conversation.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that the process that you have is the restorative grief process is mind, body, and spirit. Speak on the body part.
Yeah. So heart, mind, body, spirit is, in my opinion, the way we really experience the world around us. And I think we're just starting to see a lot of somatic practices, especially with regards to the nervous system, coming to the forefront.
Hmm.
I love hearing people recognize the impact of our nervous system on the way we respond to people, emotionally and mentally, but the physical responses, the way that our body will tense up, or
Mhm.
our breath will shallow, or we'll have an ache in a place that we're not used to aching. We've really been taught to stiff upper lip. Speaking of the queen, right?
Yeah.
Keep
Right.
calm and carry on. We've really
Right.
been told, do not be emotional, to your credit, to your mom's credit. Don't be soft. You can carry
Right.
through this life and you'll be fine. Just stay strong. Well, grievers
Right.
don't want to stay strong all the time. I personally am so tired when people point out how strong I am, because I
Yeah.
just want to find a safe place to fall apart. And so I think when we engage our body in a way that allows us to embrace stillness, and
Mhm.
to engage maybe some quiet or some silence around our body, and what we're doing, or even some just solitude where we are alone and
Right.
present with our bodies. We've, especially in faith world, disconnected from our physical bodies to a large degree, to our
Mhm.
detriment. And the
Mhm.
ability to move back towards ourselves physically really allows us to recognize that our human bodies are, this is the vessel we live within, and treating it with honor and respect looks like listening to what it has to say. Whether that's noticing that you're hungry and eating, that's like the easiest one for us to pay attention to, or temperature change. We notice that one pretty easily. But other than
Mhm.
that, and if it's not a broken bone, it's easy for us to overlook.
Yeah.
Um, and I
Yeah.
think that, like,
Exactly.
being more mindful of our bodies looks like educating ourselves around the importance of the breath, around the
Right.
importance of
Right.
movement. And like, I really love, and this is something I'm very careful with people, because there's a lot of trauma stored in our bodies that we're not aware of. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
but I really love yin yoga, because you can get into a position and it's not a super contorted position necessarily, but it is one that reaches very deeply into your muscles and your joints and all of the things that you're moving. And you
Mhm.
hold a position for, 8 to 15 minutes. You don't move.
Oh
It's
my
not
goodness.
flow. You're holding a set position. In
Mhm.
those moments, I have had more cathartic release, because my body has a moment to no longer do anything but support itself, being
Wow.
present and supporting itself, so that I'm not, dipping in one area and straining another part of my body. I'm in this
Wow.
position that's healthy but helpful, but only if I can really pay attention and be present. And
Wow.
the fact that we just don't do things like that to give ourselves a chance to be present and still and quiet often
Yeah.
enough is really why
Yes.
our bodies are constantly under pressure and struggling to support us through things. That's why,
Mhm.
indigestion,
Mhm.
constipation, heartburn, all of
Mhm.
those things can be indicators of grief, or
Mhm.
reactions when we're
Mhm.
grieving, because our body's trying to do something differently.
Yeah, I definitely can relate to that. For example, I know where I've gotten my acid reflux from. I know where it comes from. I shouldn't have it, but I definitely know that
Mm.
because of earlier relationship situation that I was in, and probably brought that on.
Yeah. Yeah.
My worry, but I'm not a up front, and I don't tend to worry because of my faith, but somehow I'm sure some of that got inside,
Yeah.
trapped, and that's why I do believe I have acid reflux till today.
Yeah.
Would get rid of it, but anyway. But so how can one access all of your information and possibly join your restorative grief group?
Yeah. So everything is linked through my website, mandycapeheart.com.
Okay.
I'm also, the Restorative Grief Project is that free private coaching group on Facebook. And you
Okay.
can just search Restorative Grief or my name and it will come up. And I'm pretty active over on Twitter and Instagram under @Mandy Capeheart. And I also host a weekly podcast called Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. And I
Okay.
just launched a premium subscription level to the podcast as well. So there's a bunch of bonus interviews and just extra essays and Q&As and live coaching sessions available for anybody that wants to come be a part of it.
Wow, that's fantastic. I definitely will share not only on my social media, but on my personal social media because a lot of people need help. And that free Facebook group would be
Yeah.
fantastic for people. So we'll have all of your information in the podcast show notes and in the YouTube description box below the video. So definitely we'll want to reach out and help as many people through something that is totally natural, but can become totally trauma related, which is
Mhm.
grief and the death of a loved one, or like you said, or any other thing. Sometimes it could be a job loss or whatever. Side note, my son broke up with his girlfriend, and so this was a person we were into. This person had a dog that we were into and loved, and then now they're broken up. And so now what? We're like,
Yeah.
uh, we'll never see our little dog anymore.
But it's
I mean,
real.
still real,
Yeah.
it's still very real.
Yeah.
So, Mandy Capehart, thank you so much for joining the Bookaholic podcast today.
Yeah.
We appreciate the work that you've done on this difficult subject that a lot of people try to avoid.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. Anytime I get to talk about loss and how to move through it, I'm in. So I appreciate it, Chance.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Bookaholics is a safe place for reading junkies who obsess over books, authors, bookstores, book news, and book trivia. We'll nerd out with book reviews, author interviews, our habit, and other bookish things. Here is your host, Deirdre Pippins.